Greetings, beloved. I intend to speak on the falsehood and Hebrews, arrogance of academic Calvinism, and how it's not the real thing. Falsehood of academic Calvinism. Now, if by Calvinism, I mean by Calvinism, just a staunch belief in the sovereignty of God in all things, especially in salvation of those whom God wills, and of hardening those whom he wills as well. So his sovereign disposition and rule over all things, especially as it pertains to salvation and damnation of individuals. So if we understand by this tag Calvinism that faith in the absolute sovereignty of God, then it's a real thing. It is the absolute teaching of the Bible. While the academic Calvinism, again defining the terms, well, it's the form of Calvinism which comes usually, especially in the place where I live in the former CIS post-Soviet countries, in the form and shape of doctors and reverends and speakers who come from overseas, bringing their books and lectures and presentations of all sorts. And it's actually in a form of indoctrination. And they establish schools and seminaries, and they teach people that Calvinism is a more excellent teaching. So what they do is they accept the basis of the Armenian gospel, so to speak, foundation, and then they indoctrinate, they continue to teach them that I will show you the more excellent way of explaining how your assumed salvation took place. And usually they gather people from other denominations, mostly Pentecostal and Armenian Baptist Union, and that sort of thing. And the reason I'm even addressing this, it's been on my heart for a long time. Well, first of all, because of the lukewarmness, this academic Calvinism, which has permeated the post-Soviet republics and everywhere, established their churches and Bible schools and so forth. It just smacks of falsehood in all dimensions, particularly with respect to the gospel itself. Well, let me give you some personal illustrations. This is not a sermon. It's a very pretty subjective analysis of someone who's been around some. So going back 20 years ago, I got kicked out from an evangelical church because of my late preaching. They allowed me to preach from the book of Romans, and then I began to preach, with very Calvinistic emphasis. The very first sermon, it triggered people, because remember where Paul thanks God for the faith of Romans, that it's been declared in all the world, and I made this point that faith is an absolute gift of God. He gives it to those who predestines to salvation and so forth. So they really gnashed their teeth, and pretty soon they kicked me out. And I thought of starting something new, brand new. And I made some connections with the Presbyterian people, lo and behold, in Ukraine. In Kiev, in Ukraine, even back then, there was this strong American influence and presence, and in the religious area as well. And I made some contacts with some Presbyterians, and they said, "Well, come on over. We'll show you the school, and maybe you'll come and study under our feet and so forth." So they believe strongly in the need of going through a seminary. And back then, I thought, well, yeah, it'd be a privilege to study under the such prominent men of God and so forth. So I went to Kiev, and I spent a day in Kiev and a day in Odessa, because the branch, they set the school. It is still in place, and it's putting out all those new ministers, as they coin them. The title of this school is Evangelical Reform Reformed Seminary of Ukraine. And the rector of that seminary at that point was Clay Quarterman. I'm going to be naming some names because otherwise it becomes sort of a nebulous story, kind of fantasy. So I want to be specific. And there was another guy by name Rod Garter. He was from the CRC. Basically, it's two denominations which joined their hands in establishing. There were some other influences, I believe, via Dutch liberated Reformed churches, but primarily the presence was there from the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, and CRC, which is the Christian Reformed Church. Anyway, so I spent there a couple of days, and immediately as I came to Ukraine, I was struck, of course, by the amount of civil freedoms that they had as opposed to what was the case back then in Uzbekistan, because I come from Uzbekistan and so forth. They had this mission station very openly with an open sign and so forth. I was just amazed how much freedom they had at that point. And I was there when they had their classes and the students, and I was just struck by the atmosphere of contentment. And I just sensed that none of the students I met or observed, not meaning that I actually kind of introduced to each other and so forth, but just people are observed. I saw no fervor for God and His gospel. I saw no fire for proclaiming the true glories of Christ and so forth. For them, it was kind of all right, we're here, and even the jokes that they exchanged really ticked me, Oh, if you're a true Calvinist, you must receive Calvin into your heart as a personal savior and so forth. It's just the type of jokes that they were exchanging and found funny. I didn't find funny at all. So you get the sense. So I was disappointed because I sort of expected back then that there'd be people like, Jonathan Edwards and at least somebody like John Gersten with the same sort of enthusiasm about the Reformed faith. No, nothing of the sort. And at that point I was kind of young and I couldn't understand why is that the case. Why is this Calvinism appears not what it should be, okay? Why is it so deceiving? But I spent there only 2 days and I said, well, look, come over and start and so forth. But the providence of God was that I never came back. And it's a good thing. They really kicked me out of there because I'd probably raised Cain over there being lukewarm. And by the way, there's another episode there while I was there, because I'm bilingual, speak English and so forth. They had that guy, Clay Quarterman, and he's a doctor. That's another thing that they love. They love all those titles, Dr. so-and-so, and their education, and Reverend so-and-so. They really boast of their achievements and academic ranks and that sort of thing. So they were teaching a course on apologetics in that school. And they had one translator, I think it was a lady, I can't remember her name now, but and she got tired, and I was there. I said, look, I can translate a class while I'm here, it's no problem for me. And so I did, basically. And again, I was shocked because the material they were using, and this is supposed to be a Reformed school, they were using a material by some Armenian. It was a clearly Armenian material there was the scale, they even drew this line on the whiteboard of different shades of perspective and attitudes toward the gospel from unbelievers. So starting from the far end of the spectrum, that they're totally negative, then kind of, mostly negative, but somewhat considering, then almost neutral, and then to a point of the zero, and then the sort of the positive thing. And so that the task of the, I can't remember everything that was done, but the main idea, the gist was to take somebody and gradually put them in the position where they're not hostile to the gospel, but more or less neutral and so forth. And I said, at some point, I even during the class, I said, look, this smacks of Arminianism. I said that, my understanding was that Calvinism teaches the absolute necessity of regeneration prior to everything. And the regeneration, the necessity thereof, is built upon the fact that the fallen man is hostile to the gospel all the way. It cannot turn itself into the position of neutrality or even being slightly positive. That's why it takes this grandiose turnover of the heart, as expressed in the words of Ezekiel, the heart of stone and put in the heart of the flesh. It takes this whole, even I remember lectures of John Gerstner on theology of Jonathan Edwards, the liberal historian who loved Jonathan Edwards. He said that the doctrine of Jonathan Edwards of regeneration was the holy rape of the soul, meaning that it really has to be imposed upon the whole being of the elect sinner in order for them to be turned to God. It's kind of, even though it's hard to fancy a, so to speak, holy rape, nevertheless, it shows what needs to happen to the heart and soul of the elect sinner. So I was trying to express this. It was, this is just a method and so forth. And again, I was struck that to me, it was, although a betrayal of the whole thing that I stood for, and already suffered somewhat because, I got kicked out from this church. And when the relationships are broken, it was a large, kind of friendly evangelical church. I got married in that setting and so forth. I had many friends, and when suddenly I became ostracized, it was kind of hurting my soul. And I thought, boy, at least we're suffering for the good thing. And now I'm encountering in this institution and in Ukraine that it's almost, it could be taught in any other established religious schools. So that was my experience as far as the falsehood of this academic Calvinism, that it was just a fake thing. Now, there's another aspect which I've been observing, it's been troubling me a lot, is that not only it is arrogant, it is man-loving, and the titles and everything else that our Lord actually taught against very strongly, that you should not be called a rabbi, don't call yourself masters and so forth, and never accept such terms as reverend and so on. So not only that, but it's interesting. I followed some of the people from that school. I was even friends on Facebook when in 2014, when this trouble started in Ukraine. This coup d'etat, which was a really ultra-nationalistic coup d'etat from the get-go, and when they overthrew the democratically lawfully elected president Yanukovych and so forth, then the right sector, all those thugs, and John McCain and Lindsey Graham said, we stand with Ukraine and so forth. And I noticed, lo and behold, that same guy, Clay Quarterman, the rector of that school, and we stand with the people of Ukraine for the pro-European choice and so forth. And I thought to myself, well, this is interesting. And then that observation was confirmed numerous times, that this imported academic form of Calvinism, which we get from overseas, indoctrinates people to be loving, big titles and books and all that stuff, because it's how you get your sort of Calvinism. And it's also by default pro-Western. It is by default pro-Western and supportive of the U.S. warmongering foreign policies. By default, they will support anything that the United States does, destruction of Iraq and Libya, Syria, yeah, no problem. But then, it's interesting that those people, in Kiev, those Americans, they were supportive of this Maidan coup just as much as Victoria Nuland or Lindsey Graham, any of those warmongering idiots in the U.S. But then you understand those politicians, they have geopolitical reasons, but these are supposed to be missionaries preaching the gospel and so forth. None of them said, look, this is an open coup d'etat. You're supposed to be respecting the powers that be, and Romans 13 is of great help, telling you not to actually revolt against the magistrates because they're God's servant to punish the evildoer and so forth. So resisting that authority, you actually go against God, according to Paul in Romans 13. But those people say, oh, we stand with the people of Ukraine. Well, what kind of people? I mean, what about those people in the east of Ukraine who did not accept that coup d'etat for what it was, and they wanted this dissent from this newly Banderite country? So, but again, this experience of observing pro-Western bias of planted Calvinistic institutions and churches and ministers in Russia, I've observed many times. Now, again, at that same year in 2014, you know, as the Western narrative puts it, the annexation of Crimea, which means that the majority of Crimeans didn't want to be part of this newly established Nazi Bandera worshipping ultranationalistic state, which was established subsequent to this coup in Kiev in 2014. So, and there was this missionary, American missionary, up in St. Petersburg, who worked long and arduously and laboriously to establish a Presbyterian denomination. He was at that point with the PCA, and then later on he was a part of another denomination, but then he went back to PCA. But anyway, his name is Blake Purcell. He's an American, a former chaplain, and also has some titles, for instance. So he tried to influence, to push the ministers who were under him, who studied in the school that he established in St. Petersburg, to write a letter, a formal letter of dissent by those Presbyterian ministers under him, saying that we condemn the annexation of Crimea, that we are against it as ministers of the gospel, blah, 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 blah. At that point, that letter never came out from their midst, as I understand, because at that point, some of those ministers, those preachers said, look, this is just politics, don't get involved in that, let's not do it. So it never came to roost, that idea. But then again, this year or last year, I think it was in the beginning of this year, in the context of this ongoing special military operation, everything in Ukraine, so for that same guy, again was pushing this idea that this established Presbyterian denomination, that they pass sort of an internal inside denominational law, saying that a minister who does not condemn the special military operation by Russia in the east of Ukraine, if a minister does not openly condemn it or even somewhat supports what Putin is doing, what Russia is doing, then he cannot preach or administer the sacraments. So basically, a minister is supposed to be deposed and silenced. He cannot carry on his call, his duty, whatever, if he is supportive of the special military operation. And this guy, Blake Purcell, it was trying to get all those ministers to sign up to this document, binding upon their consciences. Now, again, they failed because there's at least one minister who was adamantly against that idea, who was pretty patriotic and so forth. So they tried, all right, well, we're not going to go public with that and so forth. So it's kind of stymied that endeavor, that pressure. But just to show you, and the majority of Protestant, Reformed, even Charismatic, Pentecostal, I mean, we had this false prophet Sunday at Elijah, the embassy of God in Kiev. Now, back in 2014, when this Maidan coup was being in progress, he urged all of his parishioners. I mean, and this, the charismatics, I mean, they have tens of thousands of attendees and their members and so forth. To join the crowds at Maidan in order to, again, vote for this Russophobic venue of development in Ukraine. So it's interesting. And that by default, all Protestant, evangelical, charismatic, you name it, if planted by, or it's supported, financially supported by the U.S. religious groups and missionary boards and such things as that, they all favor the U.S. foreign policies. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, it's just, this is one of the reasons why I don't want to even be called by name Calvinist or Reformed. I have other major issues, but even if we take that, even if I was, almost 100%, if I subscribe to Westminster Confession of Faith, which I do not, I have serious, several differences of opinion with the Westminster Confession of Faith or any other, Reformed creed. Even if I had the doctrinal agreement, yet this whole atmosphere of academic arrogance, of loving the titles and so forth, and their bent, their bias in favor of everything that is against Russia would put me out. I don't want to be associated with this faked Calvinism, which is just another extension of the U.S. imperialistic influence. That's what it is. It's not a major, those churches are jokes in as far as their real imprint and influence upon the larger society. But nevertheless, at least as far as the religious circles, it's kind of significant that you find that, boy, and then we had a few years ago, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, this attempted again, the author of the legitimate government by this Alexei Navalny figure. Again, the total creature of the special services and so forth. And lo and behold, most Protestant churches too, we support Navalny. So it's kind of an amazing thing that, you have this bias. Everything that is pro-Western, everything anti-Russian, we'll support it somehow. Or otherwise, we'll keep neutral because our citizenship is in heaven. Now, it's interesting that when the U.S. is bombing the shit out of Iraq and other countries, our citizenship is in heaven. We don't look into that and so forth. But when the trouble starts at our borders, then all of a sudden Putin becomes a dragon or a pharaoh. Again, at least a couple of former students and graduates from that same evangelical Reformed seminary I mentioned to you in Kiev and Odessa, at least a couple of them I heard with my own ears their very weird apocalyptic and interpretations of the Pharaoh in Exodus, that Putin is that evil Pharaoh who went after Israel, and Ukraine is pictured by the imagination of those graduates from that seminary, those Bible teachers and pastors with names and so forth. They say, well, Ukraine is experiencing that because it's a Christian nation, basically. Well, yeah, there are quite a few churches, yes, supported and backed by the states. And again, all those institutions like this seminary, it doesn't make it into a Christian nation. Come on. There's people who actually bow their knee to the Nazi greeting of Slava Ukraine and to heroes, glory to Ukraine, and to the heroes. It's a Bandera made, and his organization of Ukrainian nationalists back in 1942 in Krakow, Poland. They were all fascists, they were all Nazis, and you were supposed to raise your hand, your right hand in this Nazi greeting. It's basically the same thing as Hitler's Nazism. It's just with the Ukrainian flavor, and you have a little different names there, like Stepan Bandera, but he was on the same page with Hitler as far as ethnic dominance, the ethnic purity, racial purity, and everything's just on the same page, just as evil, just as monstrous as Adolf Hitler. And lo and behold, you have monuments, statues of Stepan Bandera all over this ridiculous modern Ukraine. And they say, well, he was a hero, he was a nationalist, he fought for the independence of Ukraine and so forth. And the Christians in Ukraine support that. Now, I understand that under Zelensky, people get persecuted. I mean, this American Gonzalo Lira, he got thrown into, I guess, he was grabbed by the SBU thugs back in April. And no one has heard anything from him. His father said that he's probably being tortured by thugs of SBU and secret Ukrainian service. It's just, and Christians support it. I mean, I understand that they're scared, but well, just keep your mouth shut. No, they openly support what their Nazi government is doing, funded by the US tax dollars. And the so-called Calvinists support it. And you have even support here in Russia by some say, yeah, we broke this commandment not to steal when we took Crimea. I heard with my own ears an elderly Reformed gentleman who said that. This is the nature of this Calvinism. I don't want to have anything to do with that sort of thing. It stinks. It's lukewarm. It's ecumenical. It is false through and through. And it is by default pro-Western. So just wanted to vent that and to just make this point clear. I hope it might be interesting to some of you. May God bless you all.